Well, hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of Ridge Talk. We're glad to have Luch back in studio with us.
Heyo.
Back fresh from a mission trip to North Africa.
Yeah.
That you led with. How many other people went with you?
There were 4 other people, so there were 5 of us that went, and yeah, it was a great trip.
Just to prime you guys for the next few episodes from now, we're going to get everybody who participated in that mission trip together and kind of have a debrief about what took place, what God did in their lives, and what they were able to see outside this country, and to see how God is at work in an international community in really interesting ways from the little bit that I've heard so far from you. So.
I'm really excited about that conversation. I think it's going to be enlightening.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely going to be a breath of fresh air for all of you not listening to us talk and get to hear from some others.
It'll be good to do that here because there's so many, like we'll do some stuff on stage here before long, and the reality is there's just so many layers to what we saw and experienced and learned that it would be really hard to summarize it in a, like a 5-minute snippet.
Yeah.
There's the whole layer of like, well, here's just what we saw. And then there's the layer of here's what the workers over there are doing and the ways that they're serving. And there's lots of different things that are going on there. And then there's also the layer of transformation for the people that went over. And so ways that, we are different.
I can't wait to hear about it.
Yeah, it's going to be good. I mean, oftentimes in a service setting, we get to present like a little bit of a snapshot. I think we all admit that there is something inadequate about what we're able to provide, like in a Sunday morning context related to something like a mission trip. Because we do all this build up of like, hey, we need you to give money. Want you to pray, want you to consider going. And then oftentimes what happens is like the people go, half of us aren't even aware that they're on the trip. They get back. They've had a life-changing experience that is likely to be one of the more profound experiences that they will have. And then we see like a 5-minute slideshow of some pictures that capture small static moments of it. And then we move on.
Yeah.
And it's just like this little, it just feels so inadequate in light of what it means to the people that go and who are on the mission field.
One of my biggest regrets from this past Sunday was that I didn't say anything about it. I didn't say, hey, they're all back. Welcome them back. We're glad they're here. It was just kind of a misstep on my part.
Yeah,
you can't hit everything, but anyway.
So we do want to provide that opportunity for them to share. And really, here's the honest truth. We want it to be something that would draw more people into going on these trips.
Yeah.
Really, here's the thing that I've discovered oftentimes in the many mission trips that I've taken is it's not really driven as much by the need for the people in whatever host country you're going to have you come. Like it does bless them. There are tangible things that you can take. Yep. It is encouraging for them to have people from somewhere else take the time and the effort to come and be with them. But it's not like they desperately need some random team from the United States to show up and change everything for them, right?
Right, no.
It oftentimes ends up being, I think, more transformative for the people that go than it really ends up being for the people who are in that country and in that context.
Oh, I completely agree. That's part of the missions document we wrote out. They're like, hey, this is twofold. We're going to support the work that's there, but really we want you to go so God can change your heart.
Yeah, because imagine like if somebody dropped into our lives for a week, it would be a little bit of a disruption, a little bit like you would be changing to accommodate that. It's not all like some of it is this like inconvenience, disruption for them, and then they get back to like normal life. But the real life change happens in those that go and gain a different perspective, get to go see how God's at work somewhere else and kind of see like just really the thing that I've always been amazed about going on the mission field is just seeing the commonalities in how God moves in people's lives in vastly different cultural contexts.
And what we're talking about is an inevitable thing. So when the people who were back on Sunday, I did get to visit with them. I'm not going to give away the whole thing, right? But I did ask him, I just asked him very pointedly, how are you looking at the world differently? And how are you looking at your home and where you live here? How do you look at this differently now that you've been gone a week? in North Africa. And 0 of them said, oh, that's about the same. I don't really. Every single one of them had a clear answer for, I never knew this, and I never saw the world this way, and now I do, and I can't unsee it.
Yeah.
And so that is really a big part of this. We want you got to break outside of your comfort zone and your bubble in order to see God move in your life in a different way.
Yeah, and so I bring that up simply because things like what we're going to do on Ridge Talk really are from a heart of desiring to get people interested in going. We really do believe in the power of what mission trips has to do with our congregation and the potential that it has to really transform hearts and lives here by going somewhere else.
1,000%.
It's been 9 years since I've been on the mission field. Before that, I was averaging 2 trips a year for about a decade. And man, there's just I find myself craving like stepping outside of our culture, just getting a break from all the stuff that we deal with, and getting to see human perspective in a different culture. I get to see how God works. There's something so refreshing about that, and it's something that I desperately miss. I'm hoping to go on one of the next trips with Southridge, just because that it's something extremely valuable.
I was
for
about
me.
to
Like,
say, you
I'm
heard it here first, people. Sean will be leading a trip 2024.
He texted me while we were out there after we got back or something, and was like, man, I wish I was there. I wish I went or whatever. I was like, well, you should just lead it. Like, lead the next one.
I saw like 2 pictures and I'm like, all right, I'm in.
Yeah.
So yeah, we really do want to encourage you to consider going, and especially those of you who would be thinking that's the last thing that I would be interested in. Sometimes I think that that's like the best person to go.
I agree.
So yeah, we'll be hearing more about that, so we won't give too much more away. You'll hear it a little bit on a Sunday morning coming up, but then make sure to tune in to an upcoming Ridge Talk when we really get to spend some time with them. And so we're going to shift gears a little bit. We've been asking you guys to submit questions, and I'm going to be honest, it's been several weeks now since we've gotten a question.
But we got one this week.
We got one this week, and we are thankful for it, and we really need you to continue to send in questions, because otherwise you're just hearing whatever we come up with, and we're starting to run out of good ideas. So you are going to see the limit of our intelligence and our ability to come up with things, and then everybody's just going to be disappointed. And it's just, so please send us questions, because we really do enjoy this. We believe that it has a value, but it really does stand on the shoulders of your engagement with us. And so just keep sending those in. You can call the voicemail number, or you can text those or email us questions, and we'll do our best to answer those. So we did get a question this week. Daniel spoke on Psalm 12, and the funny thing about this was both Luch and I were out this past Sunday, so we had no context for this question. We both kind of came in like, "Hey, Daniel, what's this talking about?"
Right.
Because,
and I tried. I was still kind of recovering from getting back from the trip, and I literally tried to watch the sermon from home. I was like, well, I'm not gonna be able to get up and come, but I can watch, and I fell asleep. So
which if you're gonna sleep through my sermon at home is the way to do it. So
and so like it's in Psalm 12, and David here is going to God with some issues that he's having about what things people are saying, probably slandering the people of Israel, maybe even slandering God. And he's kind of crying out to God for God to do something about that. And I'm going to have one of you guys read the context for that. That way we can set it up for this question to make some sense.
Yeah. Do you want me to read the whole psalm, or just read? I mean, verse 3 is the one that kind of starts.
Verse 3 is the imprecation. It's the petition. So I would do that, but then it's contrasted in verse 6 with.
Okay, I'll leave it pulled up, and I can come back to it.
Verses 3 and 6. Yeah.
Okay. So 3 is Psalm 12:3 is, may the Lord cut off all flattering lips, the tongue that makes great boasts. And then verse 6 is, the words of the Lord are pure words, like silver refined in a furnace on the ground, purified 7 times.
Yeah, there's no mystery to that at all.
Well, okay, so what's the question?
The question is this. Is it possible that the reason that God did not directly answer David's request to stop and strike down his oppressors because David himself was to solve his own issues, but in God's timing and for God's glory?
Okay, I'm realizing now that reading verses 3 and 6 do not give the full context for that. You also need verse 5. So a unique, one of the things I said Sunday, there's a unique element of this psalm that it's not typically in a lament, and that is the God's words are stated explicitly.
Yeah.
So that doesn't always happen. In fact, it usually doesn't happen in a lament where God answers the petition directly.
Yeah.
And so verse 5, if I'm remembering, it's because the needy groan and no, you got to read it. I'm sorry.
Because the poor are plundered.
The poor are plundered and the needy
because
groan.
the needy groan, I will now arise.
Yeah.
I will place him in the safety for which he longs.
And that's God answering.
That's
David.
God answering, and then that evokes the praise in verse 6, which is the words of the Lord are pure, like silver refined seven times. And so I made the point that, okay, he might be talking about all the words of God are pure, and that's a true statement. I think he's talking specifically about verse 5, which would be a direct response to his petition. He said, God, will you cut off the tongues and cut off the lips and, of the people who are wicked? And God's answer was, I've seen the issues and I'm going to move them into safety.
Yeah.
And so the point that I made was God he answered the prayer, but in a better way. He didn't say, okay, David, you got it. I'm cutting him off right now.
Yeah.
He said, what you really need is safety. And so I'm going to, that's the thing your heart truly desires. And so I'm going to place you into that safety. So that's the context of the question, that God answered the petition, but in a way that was unexpected, and that evoked the praise of God's words are so pure because they answer in ways that I wasn't. They answered what my heart truly wanted, not what I actually said.
Yeah, it's interesting as people sometimes really what's apparent there is that what David desired was for himself and his people to no longer be oppressed, right?
Right.
That's the issue behind the issue. And to get there, to get to that lack of being oppressed, David's thought was, well, the shortest route, the best route to that is for my enemies to be struck down. And what God's saying is no, I'm going to take care of your people. And doesn't say anything about what he's going to do with his enemies or not. It's just God's hey, what you really want, the issue behind this issue is not the enemies, it's that your people are being oppressed. And so I'll take care of that.
That's exactly it. And it's that idea that God's ways are higher than our ways. They're better than our ways. That David, the man of violence, is the one who said, I know how to fix this. Kill them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, David's in a context where he's leading literal armies, where it was common. One of the things that's always struck me about reading those Old Testament passages, there's one of them somewhere that says it was the springtime, the time when kings went out to war. It was just a natural part of the seasons changing. It's it's time for us to go out and fight.
That's how the story of David and Bathsheba begins.
Yeah, that
David wasn't where he was supposed to be.
That's the cultural context that David's in. And so I think in that hyper-violent cultural context where all David might have known was solving problems, solving conflicts with violence, warfare, literal, I'm going to banish my enemy type of things, he may not have even really been able to conceptualize what would a solution look like other than this. This is how we deal with things. And so God, I'm going to ask you to deal with things the way that the world deals with things.
We do that same thing all the time. It's I have a financial problem, so God, just give me more money.
Yeah.
Right. Or better yet, give me an opportunity and I'll do it on my own.
Yeah.
Right. I'm going to fix the problem.
Yeah.
And God says, what you need is contentment.
Yes.
Right.
And
what
some
you need
wisdom.
is not more money. It's you need to be content and to live within, the gifts that I've given you.
Yeah. and to learn how to steward what you have. Now, look,
I know.
It's not
a
don't
one-to-one
take that in
correspondence.
here like everybody that's in poverty just needs to like stop buying avocado toast in Starbucks. Like that's the millennial joke, right? Like you could afford a house if you'd quit buying avocado toast. Like we're not saying that. Or we're not saying that everybody who has need is there because they've been
scarcity's not
irresponsible
real. We're not
or
saying
something
that.
like that.
Right.
But oftentimes we can fall into that trap of I am going to solve my problem with some material means rather than really getting to the issue behind the issue.
Or my ability to grit it out. Versus
It
God
reminds
moving.
me of parts in the New Testament where it says things like the rain falls. God causes rain to fall on the just and the unjust. It's like God is looking at this issue like, hey, there are enemies here, like real enemies oppressing, and God's way of dealing with the world doesn't seem to be like, oh, wipe out everybody who's evil and that's how good flourishes. It's like, hey, the world exists. The rain falls on the just and the unjust, like people who are evil and who have bad intentions and who oppress, like still live on the earth. Oftentimes what we see is that God is more concerned about dealing directly with people and about redemption rather than he is about punishment.
That's
here
right,
in this
yeah.
life, right?
So what was the question? It was
So the question is kind of two parts. So the first part is it possible that the reason that God didn't directly answer David's request to stop and strike down his oppressors because David was supposed to solve his own issues, but in God's timing and for God's glory? We kind of hit on this idea of sometimes there's an idea that's perpetuated, Luch, I think you said it, that God helps those who help themselves.
Yeah, that idea, I'd probably heard it before, but it's kind of a funny way that it really sunk in. A while back, I was listening to a song by the band One Republic, which, whatever, their music is sometimes fun and upbeat, but also kind of silly. Anyhow, one of their songs called Preacher, and I have it pulled up here. The chorus of it, it says, when I was a kid, my grandfather was a preacher. It goes on a little bit lower. It says, he said, God only helps those who learn to help themselves. And that was something that when I first heard it, I was like, oh. And then as I listened to the song a few more times, it started rolling over in my head. And I was like, well, I don't know about that. Like that, there's something that like, I don't know. I'd love to throw it to you guys and say, what do you guys think about that? Because I was just kind of unaware of that way of thinking. But then I was like, well, if the lead singer from One Republic is writing that, like, there's people out there that think that, because he wouldn't be. I don't think he would be making it up.
yeah. It's a common phrase. God helps those who help themselves.
Yeah.
And that I don't think is a Christian theology. Like I don't think that's a very Christian idea.
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit yesterday, and I think, Daniel, you said this. God's ultimate goal for people is not self-actualization.
Yeah.
It's not that you become the best version of yourself, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, stand on your own 2 feet in your own power according to like your potential as a human being. Because what we recognize, the truth of why Jesus needed to come in the first place was because no human being has the potential to be adequate in and of themselves. And so there is no realizing of your potential that could ever be the full purpose of God for you. And so we can't mix up this idea that God's ultimate best for us is that we would solve our own problems. I think that it's the opposite, that we would learn to surrender our problems to God and allow him to sort them out in a way that he sees fit, rather than for us to get to a place where like we're sorting it out for ourselves. Now, surely we gain wisdom, we gain discernment, we gain those things, but it's never like God's like, here, I want you to learn to figure it out on your own.
So to me, I'm probably gonna end up talking out of both sides of my mouth. I think there's nuance here that needs to be explored because So another way that I've heard that phrase put, and I'm like, that's true. It's pretty good. Is right in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells people, "Hey, don't worry about what you're going to eat or what you're going to wear, because the flowers of the field they're adorned greater than Solomon, and the birds of the air they don't worry about what they're going to eat."
Yeah.
So the teaching was about don't be anxious about those things, and so I've heard the phrase that God feeds the birds, but He doesn't put the worms in their mouths. And that's interesting, right? That's true. God, worms don't just drop in the nest and they're there for them. The birds actually have to go and do something. So there is something that feels true about God when we put forth some sort of activity that God can bless. That I think if it's done in faith, I think there is something to that, but I am going to balk against it when it's our plans above God's plans and it's some sort of self-actualization, because the self-actualization version that's like really close to what Psalm 12 is Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane. Right? He took action.
Yeah.
He pulled out his sword and cut a guy's ear off, right? Because that's what we do. Cut off the ears of the wicked or whatever it is. And Jesus said, put away your sword. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And so just activity and saying God will bless it, that's also not right. And so it's a nuanced conversation, I think.
And I think what I mean more by that is like it's not a lack of activity, it's not a lack of personal growth, but God's end goal isn't for you to be the best version of yourself, it's for you to be like Jesus.
Right. It's not for us to be glorified, it's for Him to be glorified. And but as He is glorified, then we participate in that somehow.
Yeah, and that was the second part of this question, which is interesting. It says, was the reason that God didn't answer that was so that David could solve his own issues, but in God's timing and for God's glory. I'd love to know, like, what the meaning behind solving his own issues. Does that mean like completely on his own? Does that mean with God's help and guidance and wisdom? I know for me that like doing it on my own, certainly 99% of the time, if I'm just doing it in my own wisdom, it's not going to be for God's glory. It's going to be some like disaster.
It's a good way to make a bigger mess of things, in my experience.
And I think I just look at that and I think, I have so many thoughts. I think the way I preached it was that God didn't deal with them at that time. Now, maybe He did. So that's the two things. One is it's speculation, right?
Yeah.
We don't know. Is it possible that God did this for this reason? Well, we don't know. He doesn't tell us. And so it's just speculation. Is it possible? The way I preached it was that God withheld retribution from the wicked at that time, but the curse, the petition that David called upon in Psalm 12 landed on the cross.
Yeah.
It landed on Jesus. And so, because I wanted to get to Jesus, and that's really it, that the wicked weren't punished for their words. He was punished for their words.
Yeah.
And so, it's kind of hard to know exactly how that all played out, but I think that's part of it. Speculation is difficult for me, and I'm just going to balk against any form of, like you said, self-actualization, where it's a self-aggrandizing and glorifying that you need to figure this out on your own.
Yeah.
Typically, God's like, I'll take care of it for you.
Yeah. What's interesting too is, like, I think the first human impulse is, oh, I've come up against something, whether it's a cultural issue, whether it's an interpersonal issue. Like when we talk about enemies in our context, very rarely are we talking about the same type of enemy that David would have been talking about. We're not talking about like a nation state or a people group that's literally trying to kill us. That does exist. Obviously, there are conflicts around the world right now. But I think for us, like specifically us in an American church context, when we would think about enemies, what are we talking about? We're talking about interpersonal stuff, maybe with a boss, a coworker, a family member, a friend. We're talking about cultural influences. We're talking about the culture of our country or our state or whatever that might be, other ideologies, all of those types of things. And so the interesting thing to me about that is I think our first impulse oftentimes is to want to fight against those things. And it's like, because we feel the need, like we got to push back against this. And if there's any sense of injustice, like we want justice to take place. And I think your point about for David, it was like all of the wrath, all of the punishment, all of that was poured out on the cross onto Jesus. And so like the justice that we crave as human beings when we're presented with unjust situations, ultimately at some point is taken care of on the cross and then at the end of time. That God will not leave unjust things unsatisfied at some point. Now that gets to be a slippery slope because we can use that to dismiss injustice. Correct. We can use that to turn a blind eye. We can use that to ignore. And I'm not saying that one bit. I'm not saying that we don't speak up against injustice and wrong. But what we have to take comfort in is that God ultimately will reconcile all of those things. And so even if we find ourselves in a situation where something feels unreconciled, and I want to be careful here. I don't want this to sound like I'm trying to cover over big things, right? Like systemic issues. I'm not saying this as an excuse for like big issues that people have faced, but I'm saying like in our little interpersonal stuff, oh, I feel slighted by this person. This relationship broke down. There is an ability, I think, to find a freedom from that in going like, hey, ultimately all this stuff gets sorted out and reconciled and I can be whole. I can move on. I can find the protection of God and the wholeness in God that I need aside from this thing being set right.
I think that's exactly right.
You know, as I'm saying that, I'm hearing all these like massive structural things that people would say, but what about this? Like, please hear me. I'm not saying that we just put our head in the sand and say God will take care of big things eventually. It's not that. I think it's more
belief
like
in the sovereignty of God is not an excuse for laziness and inaction. In fact, if anything, it should push us into action.
Right.
Knowing that, hey, he's in control, and so we can work on systemic things, and we can try to, do good in our world and bring, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Like it's a prayer that we should be praying. And so, I think laziness and inactivity because, it's all going to work out eventually, that's not a healthy way to look at that.
Yeah, I hope you can hear the nuance there, what I'm saying. Like for smaller interpersonal stuff that doesn't get worked out and things like sometimes it is okay and it is the path toward healing to let something go and move on from it.
That's right.
Because what I look at there is what ended up happening in that psalm is God said, I will grant protection to those who are being oppressed. Like I'll solve this issue. And so what it does is it shifts your focus on your enemy and shifts it toward God and his provision for you. And I think that's what I'm trying to say is like, we need to be careful not to get hung up on issues when God has a way for us to move toward healing and toward his provision. Sometimes we do have to let go of some of those things or allow him to heal it in a way. That's tricky. That gets really tricky.
Yeah, the question in and of itself, I think, just touches at, none of this is easy. Like the whole thing with the psalm, like David wouldn't be crying out with this issue, if things were going great. Like we have other psalms of praise. This is not a psalm of praise. This is a song of lament. This is a song of, in the midst of a tough moment. And so, when you're in a tough moment, I think it is flippant to assume that like, well, the answer's simple. You got
that's
A,
right.
B, and C, and it'll all be taken care of.
Life is much messier than
and
that.
it's also not like get over it and trust God. That's
right.
not
There's more to it than that as well. Like it's not just simply pick yourself up and go get it and work harder. It's not just that, although there might be an element of that.
Right.
It's also not simply it's all going to work out in the end. that may be that is also true. But there's also,
or maybe it doesn't.
Yeah,
and you have to learn to live at peace with
ultimately,
that.
the big things work
Yeah.
out in the end. And you even touched on this. Like, how did it work out for the wicked people that David's talking about? Well, we don't actually know. We know what happens to wicked people in the end,
Who are unrepentant, right?
unrepentant. Yeah, like we know what happens there, but yeah, the in between and how do you get through those moments? It is tricky and it is nuanced and it is hard. And I think even my thought is having this conversation. Like, we need other people to speak into that.
That's right.
We need to be reminded of, hey, that is hard. That thing that you're crying out to God about and you're telling me about, like, that is hard. Like, and sometimes, in those conversations, it might be like, well, here's a way forward. Here's something you might step into. Other times, like, you're in that and it's like, man, can we just, I want to pray for you and kind of let's just sit in this and maybe there's a way forward, but I don't know what it is yet.
Yeah.
And so I think that's okay too.
It's actually something that we've discussed at the leadership level is making more room for lament. Like, this is a specific type of literature that is common throughout Scripture. I forget what the percentage is, but a heavy percentage of Scripture is lament, like bigger than what I ever would have considered. There's a book called Lamentations that is dedicated to this type of, like, crying out at the soul level about injustice and wrongdoing and the grief that we experience through loss and through trauma and all of those things. And in our context of the way that we do church, we don't make a lot of room for that. Historically, growing up in the I'm 37 years old. I did not grow up in a church tradition that read through or practiced lament. And I think subconsciously or even consciously, the message that gets communicated through that is, hey, when we're gathered together, when you find yourself in this community, it's all about being positive and encouraging.
Everything's okay.
And so when you walk through on Sunday mornings, like, try to put your happy face on. We've heard that so often, how people don't, one of the big things that we brought up a few weeks ago was, like, people saying, a significant percentage of people saying that church didn't feel like a safe place to express doubt or to express grief, or like feeling like they had to pretend to be some version of themselves when they're really going through it. And so we have talked about, what does it look like moving forward to learn how to lament together as a community, to make space for this type of thing that ultimately isn't, like, the purpose of lament is not finding a solution. The purpose of lament is pouring your heart out to God and giving it to Him and saying, God, you sort this out.
Hey, you just did a callback to several weeks ago, a callback to very recently. I don't know if you remember this, and if our listeners, this is for all our regular viewers and listeners. We were talking about the liturgy and the structure of worship and how there's an element of confession. And I don't remember if I did this on screen or not, but I could not remember the other word, the synonym that I have for confession. You want to know what that word is?
Yeah.
It's lament.
Okay.
It's a prayer of lament.
Yeah.
And that's, you talk about at the leadership level, talking about building space into our services. It's something that is becoming increasingly important, I believe. And I think we're moving into a season, just culturally, where it's going to be important for us to lament well together. And so that's one of the things we want to be thinking about.
And one of the reasons that we would do that, I think it's really neat to look at Psalm 12, because it sort of encapsulates, well, why would you take the time and the effort to do that?
Right.
It's because you have a God who will answer and says, I've heard you, I've seen what you're going through, and I have a way forward for you. That's why we would do it. Otherwise, it's pointless, right?
Exactly.
Otherwise, it's like just an empty exercise where, there might be some catharsis in, like, in getting things off your chest, right? But what we would say is the reason why something like a lament as a community would be important was because it points us to a God who says, I see you.
Yeah.
I'm for you. I've got a way forward for you.
One of my friends who It's such a sad story. His daughter, who is still very, very young, a year old, just turned a year old, very suddenly got sick, and doctors didn't know what was going on. Sent her home from the hospital, and she woke up. She didn't wake up, and she passed away. And I got to visit with that friend a little while after that, and asked him how things were going. And he told me that one of the least helpful things that people said to him was, "This happens for a reason."
Yeah.
And he said, "You know what? I believe in the sovereignty of God. I've got a high view of God. I believe in the sovereignty of God. I know that God does everything for a reason. That doesn't help me at all.
Yeah.
That doesn't change the pain in my heart." He said, "Let me tell you," that was the least helpful thing people would say to me. He said, "Let me tell you what the most helpful thing that people said to me." He said, I've been drawn back to, and I remembered Jesus, right before he raised Lazarus from the dead, he went and visited with Mary and Martha, and that's the shortest verse in scripture. Jesus wept.
Yeah.
He said, "When I realized that I have a Savior who weeps with me,
Yeah.
he laments with me, he sits with me in my grief,
Yeah.
and he doesn't tell me, 'Don't worry, it's for a purpose.'
Yeah.
He says, 'I'm sorry,
Yeah.
and I weep with you too.'" That's powerful.
Yeah.
And so being able to help people walk through that is, like I said, it's going to be increasingly important.
Yeah, we want to get better at that. We want to get better at providing space for that, of being people who are comfortable not walking through the doors with some pat solution. Because sometimes the solution is just sitting with people in their grief, in their sorrow, and saying, "I'm here with you.
Yep.
Grieve with those who grieve, rejoice with those who rejoice." Like, that is the type of leaders that I know we each want to be, and the type of church that we want to build. And so that's our hope and our prayer.
Yep.
I think that's a good place to end.
Yeah.
Hopefully we answered that question sufficiently. If not, then
Hit us up.
please, like I said, continue to submit more questions. We hope that this is a blessing for you guys, and we look forward to the next one. Thank you.